Hello, it's Steve Smith here again, and this is the 19th presentation in this series for second language teachers, and this one's just called Dissecting a Lesson. When I wrote my book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher in 2017, I was looking for something different in the book that would set it apart from other books, and one thing I decided to do was to devote 3 or 4 chapters to pulling apart individual lessons to enable new teachers in particular to think about how they can build up a lesson and what different activities they could include. So this is an example. This one wasn't actually in the book, or this is one that we did include in Breaking the Sound Barrier, actually, our book about listening, the one I wrote with Gianfranco Conti. So, if you've got your cup of tea or coffee ready, or your glass of IPA, or your glass of Sauvignon Blanc, let's go. Now, actually, this lesson is adapted from something I read in Chapter 3 of Jack C. Richards' book, Key Issues in Language Teaching. If you don't know of Jack C. Richards, he's a veteran writer about language teaching methods and second language teaching in general, and that's certainly a book I can recommend to you. The original lesson was planned by someone called Diana Croucher, an English language teacher working in Barcelona, but I've actually adapted it a bit and put some tweaks in and some extra advice of my own here. So it's an example of the sort of lesson you'd use within the communicative approach, and I think ideally this would be for a class who've done a minimum of about 3 years of the second language, possibly 4 or 5, depending on the class and their abilities. It's certainly a multi-skill lesson, but with a focus on listening and on comprehensible input. So I'm going to describe this to you in 7 parts. It's actually quite a low preparation lesson. The whole thing might take you in the region of, let's say, 40-45 minutes, something like that. And to start with, you're simply going to show the class a photograph from an event in your life. The example I'll show you in a minute is actually from one of my holiday photographs. And to begin with, almost as a pre-listening task, you could just do some simple whole class question answer work describing the picture. What's actually in this picture? Who is it? What are they wearing? Etc., etc. And if classes need that, you could give some sentence options on the board for them to choose from, so they could do it as a reading aloud task, or let's say a matching up task. So the picture I've chosen was one of my wife and I on holiday. This was in the Canadian Rockies. It was part of our grand tour across Canada with the Canadian train from Toronto to Vancouver, which I can really recommend. Fantastic experience. And we stopped off in Jasper for a week, and we explored that area, which is stunningly beautiful. And this was a picture that someone took for us, actually. You can see there. I don't know which lake it is in the background. And this is the basis then for some talk about a journey, I guess, and holidays. Apologies for my misspelling of Canadian over there. So you'd start off by telling the class you're going to describe an important event in your life, something that happened to you. And bear in mind that that should raise interest to start with. Students are probably going to be more interested in hearing material about you as a person. They're probably interested in you more than they might be from something on an audio tape or something like that. You could bring in an artifact or some objects or something to support your story, to show them, to make it more interesting. The linguistic focus here will be on high-frequency language, which you'll try and repeat as much as possible, and you'll be using the past tense, preterite in English, or whatever that tense is called in your language. So, to give you an idea of the level here, and of course you could adapt this to the class, so I'll just put this in English for you. You can just read that through. As I say, you can adapt this to the class. If you want to include some more exotic vocabulary for an advanced class, then great. If you're trying to pare down the language to make it comprehensible for a less experienced class, then do whatever it takes. Then it's simply a question of recounting your story. I say a couple of times, maybe more, but I think maybe a couple is enough, provided that you use some really good language teacher techniques to make the language comprehensible. So there's a number that I thought of. Certainly slowing down to a degree, repeating yourself, particularly with language that you think might be less immediately comprehensible. So building in natural pauses and repetitions, maybe paraphrasing some sections of your text. So if you, again, suspect that they might have trouble understanding, then find a different way to say it. You might want to use gesture to supplement your language. You're probably going to focus on using language that you think the class will know. So you'll have a pretty intimate knowledge of what you have done with the class, and it would make sense to angle your language to use chunks of language and individual words that you know the class have practiced previously. You may well want to favour cognates, so in those moments when you have a choice between two words, it might suit you to use the cognate to help with the understanding. I think varying intonation is also important. That helps with students breaking down the stream of sound and also just makes your delivery more interesting to listen to. I would certainly consider the use of occasional sandwiching. Sandwiching, that's the technique sometimes called echoing, where you say something in the target language and then you just repeat it briefly in English. It's always, I think, a technique which can be useful, but one where you've got to be careful about using it excessively. Otherwise, the danger is that students will just tune in to your use of English and not focus on the target language. And also, I'd suggest that you check for meaning. So you'll have a pretty good idea of what your class can understand, but there are ways of checking for meaning, just occasionally asking for hands up, for example, just to repeat something in English back to you. You maybe could even use your mini whiteboards to that sort of effect. So I'm saying here, use all your clever teacher skills to make the language as comprehensible and interesting as possible. Now, once you've been through that, let's say at least a couple of times, you could ask the class, either in the first or second language, and that may depend on the class, to share their notes with a partner. So, yeah, I mean, I am suggesting that on one of the listenings, students write down notes here to help focus their listening. And then once they've got their notes, they can report them back to the teacher. Now, the choice here of first or second language is interesting, and I think probably for this exercise, I'd get them to do this in their own language, in the first language, because you really want the focus to be on meaning here. If you're getting them to focus on written accuracy, that might divert their attention from the main aim here, which at the moment is listening for meaning. So I would suggest notes in the first language, but with an excellent class you might consider the second language. So they've shared their notes with a partner, just informally, helping each other, looking at each other's notes, helping each other. Oh, did you get that bit? I didn't get that bit. Oh yeah, I think she said this, or I think he said that. And then you could get them to report them back to you, just informally with hands up. And as they do that, then you could write up the notes on the board. So as they are coming back to you with points, let's say in English, you would then instantly translate them onto the board. In other words, you'd be going back to use the language that you'd previously used, so that now they can see it in writing. So you're now scaffolding the task again. So key thing there, I think, is to recycle the language that you used in the original account and make sure that you say it out loud so they can see it. And you could easily get them to repeat some stuff out loud as well. Then, once you've got quite a bit of language on the board, on your whiteboard or your interactive board, you then could maybe rub out parts of that displayed language, depending on the class, and then see if students could recreate your original account in the target language. They could then report it back to you, and you could make some light touch recasts or corrections. Recast is when you're not explicitly correcting. It's when you're just sort of reformulating what they say in a more correct manner. Or you could explicitly correct if you think that works with the class. That previous step, by the way, I would suggest as well, one thing you could do, if you have scripted your story, you could then simply display the whole script, and then use the disappearing technique, for example, disappearing text technique, to take sections away. Now, if the class is ready for this, and this might be in a following lesson, for example, students could then talk about an important event in their own life. It could be based on their own picture. So you could give them 10 minutes to make some notes in the target language, but not to write a whole script. You don't want them writing this out. It needs to be somewhat more spontaneous, and then they could deliver that account to a partner. That's a sort of task that you do with a class that was proficient enough for that. With some classes, they wouldn't be ready to do that with enough accuracy or enough skill. So you would hold back that sort of exercise. And then perhaps as a written task, perhaps as a homework, if there's a culture of good written homework, they could write out and record their account. You might want to provide some sort of template for that. It could be just a gap fill to do for the weakest students. It could be one of these structure strips, if you haven't heard of those. Some teachers enjoy using these as a template for writing. This was one that was shared on Twitter. It was actually for English, but just to give you an idea, you give some prompts down the left-hand side. So you cut off, print out a strip, and these prompts can be as detailed or as vague as you want them to be, and then students have to write to the prompt, and that acts as a reminder of the level of detail that they can include. You could even include in your structure strips, brief chunks and phrases that they should use. But, much depends on the class and the level of support that they need. So here you can see then that we've combined listening with speaking, with reading, and with writing. So all in all, I think an interesting lesson, one that would be memorable and enjoyable for students and would focus a lot on listening. So that was the book that my Dissecting a Lesson chapters appeared in, and that specific lesson was described, I think it was in chapter 6 or 7 of Breaking the Sound Barrier by myself and Gianfranco Conti, and another mention for our general handbook, the Language Teacher Toolkit. Thank you very much for listening, and in the next session I'm going to go on to talk about writing. Bye for now.